he has this line toward the end where he talks about when the church was dedicated, and he talks about how he's looking forward to meeting in heaven those who were blessed by this ministry, both black and white. In other words, he is making this line that not just black folks were members of this congregation, but white folks as well. Okay?
Well, thank you for watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project. And today I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Nicholas Rowe. Welcome, Dr. Rowe. How are you doing?
I'm well, trying to keep warm out here.
You're in Boston, right?
This is true. Yep.
Yeah, so I can imagine. I think it's 80s here, so I'm nowhere far from where you are.
We're envious. It was just about freezing last night. Hence the headwear.
So before we get started, just let our audience know just a little bit about who you are.
Sure. So I serve at Gordon College, which is just north of Boston. I'm the Dean of Student Engagement here, which means that I oversee all student learning activities outside the four walls of the classroom. But I'm also Associate Professor of History and Peace Studies at this institution as well. So I specialize in Atlantic history. So I look at a lot of different things across the Atlantic, particularly racial interactions and other cultural things having to do with the Atlantic context.
Awesome. And I met you in St. Louis. So I'm excited to talk to you today on this topic that I think it's very important, the formation of the Black church. And so for those who are thinking through why the Black church exists, many times when you say Black church, they're like, well, for our white brothers and sisters, they might say, well, the church is not based on race. The church is just the church. When you get that kind of question, how do you talk about how the Black church was formed?
Yeah, well, look, the Black church is a thing, right? I mean, it's despite any claims that it's just a church. Unfortunately, we have the church and particularly Christian formation of people of African descent within an American context that was racialized, right? Intentionally racialized. So the Black church basically evolves because of, unfortunately, racist structures within the society that separated people on the basis of their racist background. We're grateful that the Holy Spirit works in the context of all things, whether they be good or bad, to be able to do his work in terms of formation and growing his people. But these are the structures that were in place. It didn't stop the Holy Spirit from forming people and shaping people according to what we talk about in the scriptures, conforming them to the image of Christ, but it was within these racial structures that it took place. And so within the context for people of African descent, this is the Black church, right? It's the context in which we were separated out of the main society, and we had to take care of formational matters in that context.
When we think about the Black church as an organizational structure, we immediately usually go to the AME church. Can you tell us why that is so, and what is the AME church in this formation? How was it formed?
Yeah, look, the Black church in the largest context of it had many paths to its formation. And largely those formed within the context of various denominations within the US. So particularly in the early part of American colonial society, of which people of African descent have always been a part of from the beginning, you had largely Baptist congregations, you had Calvinist separatist congregations coming from England, and then you also had the rise of Methodists who basically, the Methodist Church basically started in England under the powerful anointing of John Wesley, who sought a more, shall we say, inspired, emotional, holistic connection to God in terms of worship, but also in terms of practice, right, and devotion, as opposed to the state-sponsored Anglican Church, right? One that could reach and appeal to the common folk, as opposed to the sort of high church, very intellectual aspects of the Anglican Church. So when it came to the US, Francis Asbury, who was born in England, was sent to the US to begin the Methodist movement here, these small circles, these small meetings. In many ways, we say that the AME Church is one of the first institutionally autonomous, right, racially autonomous churches that get formed. I mean, there are other churches that form among Baptists and other sort of denominations, but as far as the AME Church is concerned, it is the first denomination that is totally under the control of people of African descent, right? It's an offshoot of the Methodists, and there's a long story about that, obviously, we'll talk about today. But for all intents and purposes, it is the first denomination that's formed that is institutionally and autonomously controlled by people of African descent. So the Black Church precedes that. There are sort of separate Black congregations within those contexts, but institutionally speaking, right, this is the first denomination where you see African Americans that are in leadership and in control.
Mm-hmm. Before we get into how kind of the start of the AME as an organization, talk a little bit about those Black churches that existed maybe before the formation of the AME denomination.
Yeah, so for a lot of people of African descent, I mean, people could come to faith. People came to faith in a variety of different ways. Usually, for good or for ill, they came to faith within the context of being within a slavery structure by which, their masters, their white slave owners, would expose them to Christianity. It was a mixed bag in terms of that. Some of them thought it was a good idea to do that because it would, and they would take scripture out of context, and they thought that by making them Christian, they would be more amenable to the institutional structure of slavery and the social order. A lot of slave owners resisted that wholeheartedly because inherently, Christian message talks about freedom, and they immediately were intimidated by that or threatened by that they might start giving them ideas about their own autonomy, right? Whatever the case may be, in both cases, you had Black folk coming to faith in the context of that. More often than not, though, in a lot of those different situations, they would often sneak off by themselves to have their own occasions for worship and gathering together to be in God's presence and to worship and learn from together. They did these usually under the cover of night, usually out in the woods, away from the plantations and away from the fields from which they worked, and which they set up locations made out of trees and everything else, brush arbors they called them, where they would meet together and to pray and to seek God in the context of the things, to worship, and inevitably they'd be talking about seeking meaning and freedom in the context of those things. So it was always a bit of an informal deal. There were formal services maybe where whites were present to sort of keep an eye on things, but there were always these sort of informal, autonomous groupings and gatherings as well, where this took place. So before the formalization of these things, I mean, there was always a sense of these sorts of informal type gatherings where folks would gather together to worship and to pray.
Mm-hmm. That's helpful. So when we think about the formation of the AME denomination, we immediately think of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. Can you just give us a little bit of background about Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and who they were?
Yeah. Richard Allen obviously was born in the middle of the 1700s. He was born into slavery near around the Philadelphia area. And in growing up, the best account that we have of Richard Allen and his background was an account of his own memoirs that was written close toward the end of his life in the 1830s, where he talked about the sort of formation of the church. But his own personal story talks about how he came to faith when he was 17 years old under the ministry of the traveling ministry of the Methodist circuit preachers. And he records it as a very powerful emotional experience. It was a total whole body experience. It wasn't just intellectual assent, but just a real emotional and physical encounter with the Holy Spirit that led to his conversion. He clearly would be somebody today that we would say would be very gifted in terms of preaching, communication, we would say anointed, right? We would use the word anointed really in the full sense of that word, because very early on, he started to speak informally and to large groups, and that resulted in large numbers of folks converting as a function of his preaching. And some of the earliest leaders in the Methodist movements really realized very, very quickly. Francis Asbury, who of course is some of the foundational leaders of the Methodist Church in America, realized his skills very, very early, and invited him to come along, or also nominated him to go along with other circuit preachers on their writing circuits and their sort of campaigns. So that's how he basically entered into the ministry. He also had to work with his hands, right? It was really under the context of his ministry and his ability that his slave master, right, was converted, and through a bunch of context in terms of that, he was able to work and obtain his own freedom, which allowed him to now be further devoted to the ministry in that context. So, so this led to the context in which the events started that would lead to the formation of the church. He was assigned to a place outside of Philadelphia, where he was, again, very powerful in ministry there. And St. George's Church in Philadelphia, which was the main church where the Methodists were located, wanted him to come and minister to their small number of Black congregants. So it was predominantly white church, but they had a small number of Black congregants, and they wanted him to minister to their congregants. So they called him in with the instruction that he would minister and preach to their Black congregants at 5 o'clock in the morning, right? So that at least their needs would be sorted out before the regular service at 10 o'clock in the morning, right? So nevertheless, he worked at that, well, I won't call it an ungodly hour, because all time is God's time, but he was particularly effective in terms of that, not only in terms of working through that, but also because he noticed that there were a lot of people of African descent in Philadelphia in and of itself. And his realization of that really was the beginning of his powerful ministry in Philadelphia.
And Absalom Jones?
Absalom Jones was connected to the Anglican Church. I didn't do a whole lot of work around him, but I know that he was also, again, somebody who was very, very anointed in preaching. So he was based in Philadelphia and was working with the Anglican Church there. And so the two of them came together when some of the problems erupted that would lead to the formation of the AME, right? So they basically worked in partnership. I mean, eventually Absalom was a known figure, right? He was a ordained minister within the Anglican Church, and so, but he was also, like Richard Allen, committed to working with the Black population within Philadelphia, and so that's how they basically came to know each other.
And so, what caused them to say we just them? What event led them to form their own denomination? Right.
So, so like I said before, Richard Allen was, if you read in his account, he talked about how there was this huge harvest field, huge field waiting for harvest, by which he identified the substantial population of people of African descent in Philadelphia. Philadelphia at that time, for a while, Allen had served in the Revolutionary War, and Philadelphia was sort of the center of revolutionary sentiment. Between Philadelphia and Boston, both those cities were the center of revolutionary sentiment. Because of that, Philadelphia, because of its location, particularly closer to the South, drew a lot of freed Africans, right? Freed people of African descent. So it had a very, very substantial population. There were also folks who were slaves there, but Philadelphia and Pennsylvania as a state was going through the motions to really start to outlaw slave owning within that state. So as a result, it was known, James Forten, there's a couple of other major names, they're known to be one of the places that was, they called it the best place for a free African to live, right? Literally called it that. And so it attracted a lot of people of African descent. Many of these folks were unchurched, right? They were working in small trades and other sorts of things, but they were also financially on the margins. So Allen started working and preaching among these congregations wherever he could find space, open fields, everything else. And as a result of his ministry, lots of folks converted, became Christians. And so he started bringing them to St. George's Church, which was a predominantly white church. And then, the problem started, right? The practices of sort of cultural racism started to kick in. Within the church itself, you started to see incidents of segregation started to take place. I mean, St. George's was a reasonably decent sized building. The black folks would sit in one section of the church, the white folks would sit in another section of the church. As the black folks became more and more numerous within the congregation, they were told they needed to give up their seats, their pews, and to sit around the edges, the sort of walls around the church so that white folks can have the seats. As Allen's ministry just continued and more black folks started to come into the church, eventually the church basically started on a building project, a building expansion project, right? Taking donations from all members of the church, black and white. And so their building project consisted of building a balcony up top the regular level, where I suppose the plan was that the black folks would go into the balcony. It's not exactly clear in terms of the account what the entire plan was. What we do know is that Absalom Jones and Richard Allen were working to deal not just with the spiritual needs of the black population, but also the physical needs. They were just economically very much deprived, and there were a lot of people in very dire economic straits. So their first move was to form what they called the Free African Society. It was a mutual aid society, and they formed this in order to come together to meet the economic needs of the black population in Philadelphia. It was an informal network where they could get each other jobs and do all sorts of other things. So for Allen, in his mind, the gospel was not only meeting the sort of spiritual and intellectual needs, it was also meeting the physical need. He saw the Christian community as meeting the needs of the whole person. And I think this was something that was very, very important at the time. He combined not only orthodoxy, right, but also orthopraxis, right action, right? He combined the two of those things, and it was definitely demonstrated in terms of that. But in terms of the spiritual need, he was starting to get more and more frustrated because of the behavior of the church and the church elders, right? So one day, Allen and Jones and their black congregants came into the church to worship. They were told by the white sexton at the front door that they had to go to a specific place to go and sit. They were told that they had to go up to the balcony, and that they would be told where they were to sit, right? Because now all of a sudden the black folks had to have their own section. So either they misunderstood what he said or whatever, but they went to a particular section, and at the time of the service that they arrived, it was at the time of prayer, and as was their custom, all the congregants were on their knees. So they were going on their knees in terms of worship when all of a sudden one of the sextons came over and started rousting one of the black congregants, telling them that they can't stay there. You all got to move. To which, Allen said, well, can we at least finish praying first? We're in the middle of praying. No, you've got to move now. If you don't move now, we'll forcibly move you over. And he starts waving over some of the sextons to come over, and they physically started to roust them out. So there was all this scuffling and commotion. When the prayer part of the service was done, Allen, Jones, and all the black congregants en masse just got up and walked out of the church. To quote Allen in his memoirs, the church was no longer troubled with us. We left. So that was the beginning of, in some ways, the informal break, right, between the black congregants of St. George's and the white congregation. By no means was the matter done there, but that was the beginning of the end. Some historians dispute whether or not this was a spontaneous thing or whether this was planned, that weeks and weeks and weeks of this type of treatment broke them to the point, right? Got them to the point where Allen basically said, we have to make a statement, or whether or not this conduct of pulling them in the middle of prayer was so outrageous that just spontaneously they just decided, we've had enough. Whatever the case, it was clearly a statement for all of them to leave at once after that particular incident, never to return.
What was St. George's response?
So there wasn't any immediate response, right? I mean, the congregants left, and so then Allen and Jones are saying, okay, what are we going to do? We need to meet. We're meeting the physical needs, but we need to meet the spiritual needs of the congregants, and the spiritual needs weren't being met at the church. So we need to form our own congregation. Now, they had always thought about this, and they had actually approached the leadership of St. George's as well as the denominational leadership about building their own house of worship where they could really fully address the spiritual needs of the congregants. But they were always turned down. The elders always refused them the request to do that. Meanwhile, they continued to suffer all the indignities at St. George's. So eventually this took place. And so they went out and they said, look, you know what, we're going to have to really take matters into our own hands. And so they started to raise funds in order to build their own house of worship. They had to go to a couple of rented places in order to do that, but it was rented. They needed to have their own building to do this. The response by St. George's was not really affirmative. When they got wind that they were actually raising funds to do this, the elders sent representatives to Allen to stop the project, to stop raising funds. They threatened to, quote, read them out of meeting, essentially excommunicating them from the church to continue with this. Allen pushed back, basically saying, look, you know what? You are not doing right by these congregants. What are you going to do about it? And so this was a long back and forth. Meanwhile, Allen and Jones just continued to go ahead in terms of raising funds to put together the church. And they were able to raise a lot of money to be able to get a building and move it to the site of a former blacksmith's shop. And that's where they were able to have their first service. If you look at the logo of the AME Church, you will see smack in the middle of the logo, you'll see a cross and an anvil, a blacksmith's anvil, which is an acknowledgement of the physical location where they actually had their first meeting to this day. So the AME, that's a nod to the circumstances into which they had their first location, their first church built.
Wow, that's definitely helpful when thinking about the formation of the church. For the contributors, were there major other white denominations that saw what Richard Allen and Absalom Jones were doing and decided to help, or any who were the contributors outside of the congregants?
Yeah, look, I mean, that whole process from when they first left to when they actually first got a building Um, that was close to 4 or 5 years. This was a long time over building the funds. The one of the very curious things is that one of the major there were two major white contributors to Allen's efforts. One was Benjamin Rush, and the other one, and I'm blanking on his name now, was a major philanthropist. There's another white Philadelphian who was known. He was a major businessman who had acquired a lot of wealth in terms of the India trade, and so who became an early philanthropist. But Benjamin Rush, by far, is the more high-profile name. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence from the Philadelphia contingent. And Benjamin Rush is, well, let me say this. His spirituality was kind of complicated, right? I mean, he was raised basically as in terms of Calvinist, in terms of religion, but over time, it sort of morphed into more universalist type sort of things. He clearly was, if you would call him, a child of the Enlightenment, right? He really was strong in the understanding of the Enlightenment, the inherent beliefs of the Enlightenment of the equality of men and the inherent rights of each individual human being, okay? So you can see very much how he was a major supporter of American revolutionary ideals in terms of that. And, it's very interesting to see that out of his philosophical commitments, as well as his sort of religious commitments, if you read a lot of his own writings toward the end of his life, he basically took up the theological position, frankly, that there really isn't such a thing as a hell, that everybody eventually will go to heaven, that God will really sort it all out. But he clearly had strong, deep sympathies to the plight of Allen and his congregants, and he was one of the first white folks to sign in, and both he and this business type contributed a substantial amount. So it's interesting to see how it was mostly sort of liberal theologian, people of a liberal theological space, and a sort of a more, shall we say, secular Enlightenment bias, who saw the issue of injustice with regard to this situation and were able to, or decided to do something about it, as opposed to the sort of, you see, you have to be careful how to, because in the historical context, you can talk about conservative or sort of orthodox theology taking place. But clearly, in terms of the Methodists' hierarchy, they were definitely trying to sabotage it every twist and turn. So all during the time this was taking place, they were making threats. They actually took them to court. They were some of the biggest obstacles in trying to do this. Understand that, so Richard Island was very loyal to the Methodist Church for a couple of reasons. First, it was the context under which he came to faith, obviously, so he was very loyal for that reason, but also because of their philosophy of ministry, right? He was truly convinced that their philosophy of ministry was best in terms of reaching out to people of African descent. Yeah, because he really felt that the Anglicans were very intellectually oriented, and so it tended to go over the heads of most common people. And moreover, the Methodist philosophy of ministry appealed to both head and heart, right? There wasn't a separation of head and heart that he really feared was the case with Anglicans. And so he was very, very strongly committed to that. But the church, the original congregation, the congregation of these folks of African descent, initially said, "Hey, we're going to go with the Anglicans because we're being treated better by the Anglicans." So for a couple of years, they really went with that until they changed course, particularly when they were able to, under a lawsuit, be legally separated from the Methodist hierarchy. And all the strings attached in terms of that, and they were able to form their own congregation in that way. So there's a whole lot of church dynamics involved in terms of the formation that led to this sort of independent denomination being formed, right? Before it actually really came to fruition. But the point I think that's being made is that here are these churches that are supposedly committed to Orthodox theology, committed to historical Christian theology in terms of their orthodoxy, but the praxis was completely separated, right? In their mind, they could justify the treatment of people of African descent as inferior. Their theology did not challenge the presupposition of the inferiority of race and therefore their conduct. It didn't challenge the social order. Here was a deep irony, and I think it's important to mention Francis Asbury in terms of this. John Wesley, in particular, was an avowed abolitionist. From the beginning, he strongly felt that the institution of slavery was an existential evil, and really, he could not see how one could claim to be of faith and hold slaves at the same time. So Asbury came over strongly advocating that. So in the early days of the sort of Methodist movement, he strongly said that you cannot be accepted as a full member within the Methodist movement if you own slaves. I mean, he said that point blank. Unfortunately, within the American context, of course, because of particularly economic concerns, but also, and this was an interesting rationalization, and it's not exactly a clear-cut answer, but also because they said that slave owners who were told that they had to release their slaves also would consider the Methodist message a threat. So they refused to allow access of the circuit preachers to their enslaved African persons. And so the message preachers had to weigh whether or not to allow this to slide, if only because then they could get the gospel to enslaved Africans. So they made that compromise. They decided, okay, you know what, we will not read out of meeting, as it were, those who own slaves, only because there was the bigger goal of being able to reach the enslaved African population. But Asbury personally always had a dislike of that. And the sign of it for Asbury, the sign that you can see that Asbury personally detested this, was that when the church was officially dedicated, he spoke, he preached the first sermon, and he was there at the dedication of the building. Okay? So remember this, he's the leader of the Methodists. The local Methodist leadership was giving them all sorts of grief, but he's there, the leader of the Methodists, dedicating the building and speaking the initial sermon and anointing Francis Allerton as an official bishop, right? With the movement. So that's a powerful statement by this white Christian, this white leader, against his own denomination and the way in which the local representative of his denomination was behaving, for him to do that. And they were always very, very close, in many senses. Asbury and Allen had a very, very good relationship. But I think that statement said a lot in and of itself. As for the rest of the church, particularly the hierarchy in St. George's, and it's interesting to note, the first church that Asbury preached when he came to North America was at St. George's. It was the first church he preached at. So the irony is all over the place in terms of this. Nevertheless, here we go. Here we end up with the outcome that the folks who provide the funds are folks who we would consider to be more liberal in terms of their theological leanings today, as opposed to the folks who are more orthodox, who were the ones who were trying to undermine this type of work.
Yeah, what's interesting too is that Richard Allen still was very orthodox in his theology.
Exactly.
So he received funds from those who would not considered orthodox. So he didn't let the financial contribution change his theological conviction.
No. And the good thing was there were no strings attached. I mean, I don't think there was any particular expectation on the part of the folks who were philanthropists. I think they were just They were just operating out of their sort of intellectual sort of convictions, as well as where they thought their sort of theological convictions led them, right? I mean, they hadn't sort of reconciled it to in such a way. But that didn't stop him from accepting, the funds to do that, right? I mean, he didn't really care. I mean, he basically got the money to put it together, and so be it.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. I mean, a paper could be written on that just alone, and the
Sure.
nuances of that. And so I think it's very fascinating. When we think about how the AME denomination spread, how did it become what it is today, as far as it's spreading from Philadelphia to the rest of the U.S.?
Yeah. So the AME, there were other independent congregations that were coming about because of very similar types of situations. One of the biggest and more strategic ones was in New York. So Allen had the church in Philadelphia, but there were churches particularly in New York and other places that were also saying, hey, we have these sort of standalone congregations of people of African descent. We hear and understand your particular evolution. Can we now band together under a common polity, right? Common church polity, an organization by which we can start to do this ministry and this work. And so that's essentially what happened, right? There were some denominational or some sort of theological issues at the beginning. And so you did see some offshoots, but the original formation of the AME took place with Allen designated as the leader, but also writing down essentially what you could call the constitutional documents of the AME. And if you look at them, they're very closely related to the Methodist Church, right? And I think Allen himself was very, very, you see, I've known about Allen for a long time, but in writing about him and his formation, I have a lot of, I've really grown to deeply respect not only clearly his ministry capabilities, but his organizational capabilities as well. He understood the needs of proper organization and proper structure if this denomination, and particularly the people within the organization, was to flourish. So within the organizational structure was put into place not only church constitutional things in terms of practice, in terms of discipleship, in terms of teaching, in terms of training, but also in terms of meeting the whole needs of the person as well. I mean, those things were always knit. So that sort of Free African Society really started to work together with the church in terms of meeting the whole needs of the person. To this day, right, if you become a member of the AME, that structure is still in place. You go through this formational discipleship structure in which you not only understand the history of the church, but there's also a discipleship structure which they have to, the AME to this day has its own publishing house in which they list these things out. I mean, there's no independent church winging their own things. It's very highly structured and organized, and that's kept in place to this day, and it's very much kept to their understanding of Scripture to this day. And so within it was a very highly structured formation. And the Methodist structure was that. I mean, in terms of some of the things that the Methodists brought to the table, one of the things was church discipline. Right? They were very, very strong on that, and it really was a gift to the American church as a whole, realizing the need of communities that would reinforce not just good thinking, but helpful behavior, right? What are the church disciplines? What's good behavior as well? You think about this a bit, and you think about just the understanding of human persons and how you really can't separate mind from body. you may think all the right thoughts and believe all the right things, but if you're allowing your body to do all sorts of other random things that don't match up with this, it's not a good combination, right? I mean, New Testament talks about it all the time, and I think in many ways, the Methodists got that. They clearly understood the importance of living right, acting right, and not just acting for show, but acting, action connected to what we fundamentally believe or what you understand and believe as a means of discipleship, right? And so those things still are very important aspects of the movement then and continue more or less, at least the idea of it continues more or less to the day.
Yeah. And they it seemed like they understood it except when it came to their interaction with Africans.
Yeah. Let me also say one thing. The AME also really started to gain prominence in the context of the years leading up to the Civil War and after the Civil War, right? Because as far as Christian denominations were concerned, theirs was the one with the longest pedigree, right? I mean, it was a known institution from really early on in the 19th century, right? From the 18th century coming onto the 19th century. So when the Civil War started to draw to its conclusion, and there was a lot of thinking about not just Reconstruction, but what now does it mean for newly freed people of African descent, African Americans, free Black people? What's going to be important in terms of their whole needs? The AME in many ways was ready to go. Okay, they definitely were ready to get on with it. And there's a lot of accounts of folks looking up or really getting in touch with local AME bishops and churches who put in place aid, relief organizations consistent with this early founding, relief organizations, schools, right? Universities, so Wilberforce University in Ohio, I believe is AME related, comes out of that space. So these particular sorts of things, they had the structures in place to try to do that. And they weren't the only one, but far from it. And I think by then you started to see other sorts of denominations emerge. But because of the structure that was in place, it really, it was ready-made to be able to receive and take on the work, right, of trying to integrate African Americans into the new structure, right, to help them to start to acquire their place as free persons within the Republic, which was going to be a very, very important part of Reconstruction and what was going to happen going forward.
Yeah, that's very important. And it really, so one of the pushbacks when we think about apologetics and why this is important, because there's the narrative that suggests that slaves were not thinking and they just took this faith of the slave master without critical thinking. But the formation of the AME Church really pushes back at that false narrative, because you got somebody who's highly structured, Richard Allen, thinking critically about the needs of the people he's serving, creating organizations and relief efforts for them. And so not just concerned with the spiritual needs. So it is also concerned about economic needs, pushing back on white leaders. And so it just pushes the history pushes back on false narratives. Yeah. And so that's why I wanted to talk about that today, because I think it's very, very important.
Very much so. Very much so. Look, I mean, the AME, and again, this is not the only place, but it's interesting to know how the AME as a an African American organizational structure really pushed back against structures of white supremacy that would try to force people into a box and into a social order. In many ways, it confounded the presuppositions of this racial order. It really did. It really sort of undermined the presuppositions of the order in terms of Black inferiority, Black inability to organize well, Black intellectual capacity, in context for growth, development as a whole person, as a whole being. It really sort of, you use the word narrative. It's a strong refutation of that narrative, which predominantly did that. And I think it also confounds this narrative of it supposedly being a white religion. I mean, if you look to Allen in and of itself, I mean, understand that people of African descent were in the American context from the beginning, okay? And they made their own life out of it, right? I mean, the Holy Spirit directly deals with persons. It doesn't, it may be mediated with persons, but at the end of the day, it deals directly with persons. And it deals directly within context. And I think that's the reason why when we discuss the Black church, and this is also important to understand, not all folks who came to the New World were not Christian. There were Black folks who were Christians who came over as well, particularly from the Congo region, who were mostly Catholics. I mean, so there are folks who were spiritually aware, at least of the monotheism and the realities of that, and who came to faith in the midst of that. Who were able to experience God directly in the context of that. So in many ways, the development of Christianity within the Black context was despite white framing of it in such a way as to put people of African descent into a lower social order. They reinterpreted to adhere to the fundamental aspect of Scripture, which is all people are created in God's image, right? All people are created in God's image. God's image is directly reflected in each and every person. And so each and every person directly has a connection and a context with God. And out of that, God's face gets revealed to the rest of the created order. There wasn't any sort of filter to alter that. Which can be the presupposition of a lot of folks who are kind of say, well, we're just taking all white man's religion. No.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting, even when there's one of the prominent things in evangelicalism now is racial reconciliation. And I think two things from this story that just the formation of the African church and what Richard Allen and Absalom Jones endured with St. George points to two things. Like reconciliation is when you think about reconciliation, you also think about a relationship that existed before, that was that had some kind of a positive that you're trying to get back to. And so in America, there was never a time where Africans and whites worshiped together in a way that was dignifying to both persons.
Yeah.
And so we can't get back to something that was never there. So there can kind of be no reconciliation if the relationship really never existed. Number two, I think that when we think about how the people at St. George didn't necessarily kick Africans out, they just made the conditions so uncomfortable that we left. And so this is what I keep seeing today in evangelical spaces. The conditions are just so problematic in white church spaces. And this is not just white evangelical spaces, it's white liberal spaces as well. Conditions just are so hostile and so unloving that there is no other option but to leave. And it's playing itself out repeatedly when we see like white evangelical organizations or just white liberal theological institutions not being able to retain African American staff, students not wanting to be there because just conditions aren't conducive. And so it's not just inviting minorities in, it's also making the conditions welcoming, in which both people feel like are treated as human beings, both with the image of God. So
two comments on that. I think one is a historical one, right? I hope to have the honor of meeting my fellow historian Jamar Tisbia at some point, because he said something on Twitter the other day that I thought was a really great line. He says, and this is one of the interesting things about being a historian, and this is one of the things why people hate historians so much, because we've got the receipts, right? That's in other words, we have evidence. So one of the interesting things when you read in Allen's account, which it's a throwaway line, but it leads me to believe that he had a vision and actually something going on, which I think was extremely threatening to the social order. And it was simply this, that here was an institution that was controlled by Black folk. So that just by itself is a threatening thing. Okay, an autonomous Black institution is threatening to the social order because it undermines the narrative of the social order. Two, he has this line toward the end where he talks about when the church was dedicated, and he talks about how he's looking forward to meeting in heaven those who were blessed by this ministry, both Black and white. In other words, he is making this line that not just Black folks were members of this congregation, but white folks as well. Okay? So here's the point, and here's the continued discussion that needs to be had. Is it possible to have institutions where truly, and this is what a sort of, and I'll use the word reconciled in the sense that, reconciled implies that something at the beginning. Your point is totally right. I mean, we have to find another piece of vocabulary for this. But is it possible to have institutions where white people can be under Black leadership and it's okay, right? White folks can serve under Black folks and it's okay. White folks don't have to be in control and it's okay. That small line from Richard Allen says to me that there were white folks who were willing to serve under this Black autonomous structure, and it was okay. And I'm willing to go out on a limb to say that in Allen's mind, because remember, Allen worked within a white control structure. He worked with circuit writers who understood the roadblocks to proper ministry to people of African descent. Allen was knew white folks within the Methodist structure who were amenable to what he was trying to do. I don't think at the beginning Allen said no white folk need apply. This structure it's obviously predominantly Black, but that's because within white social structures you just don't associate with Black folk. It was not a matter of Black folk keeping white folk out. It was Black folk being rejected by white folk. But there were white folk who were willing to come under this structure and to be served and to serve under clear Black leadership. The ideal at the end of the day would be to have a church where it doesn't matter. But let's not be naive, we're not there yet. And probably one of the initial signs of healing, at least for white folks who are there, are those who would say, hey, it's like a throwaway. It's that throwaway line from the Psalms. Remember he talks about in the Psalms, David, I don't know if it's David who wrote this, but it's one of those ascent Psalms where he says, in those days, some of the people going to Israel, those who are not to Israel will grab so-and-so by the cloak and say, hey, I'm going with you because you know where God is. So white folk can go to a black congregation because we know God is there. I need to find God. I'm going to go there. I don't care who's in charge. I need to find where God is. I'm going to go. End of story. So I think from the beginning, I can't speak to what eventually happened, and obviously, the sort of social order it's a powerful spiritual force that continues to sort of divide and say you belong in this space and you belong in this space, this social order, and how it gets reinforced all sorts of ways. But a truly radical Christian act would be to say, you know what, we serve the God of the scriptures, and we are willing to revoke, we are willing to defy the social order that says, I can't be here. And I'm going to come and, as a white person, I'm going to come and serve under not token black leadership too, but within an African-American context. Or maybe both sides will have to change eventually. Let's see what that happens, right? So let's see that, because we are hearing stories now in terms of just the difficulty of black congregants to remain in so-called mixed congregations. Well, the point you well made, is the cultural context healed enough so that black folks know that their dignity is honored there when they come? It's a lot of work, and there's a lot of hidden landmines to work through in order to really have that space. Are people willing to do that work, right? Or is there that sort of thing that says, oh, well, we can tolerate so many people, but then when it comes to that tipping point, well, now all of a sudden we start looking around and start making all sorts of discussions. So all that to say is that there's a lot of work to be done, but the proof of the pudding is going to be in the eating, right? It's going to be in the praxis. What does the praxis look like with regard to that? Yeah,
I think that's important. So what books would you recommend if people want to find out more about the formation of the AME Church and Africans during that time and their spiritual formation?
You know what? I've been working on stuff for a while like now, and I'm also teaching African and Christian. So I literally have my book stacked next to my desk. So good visual aid. Look, some of these are fairly. This one is a classic, right? The Black Church and the African American Experience by Lincoln and Mamiya. These guys are actually sociologists who are looking at the Black Church, and so they come at it from a very interesting angle. But it still was a go-to book for many years. There are newer ones than this. There is a quick introduction written by Ann Penn and Anthony Penn called The Fortress Introduction to Black Church History. Carol George wrote, she writes a lot on the intersection of churches and race, particularly at the time of their formation. I'm blanking on the name of her stuff now. I should have had my paper out. I could have cited her, but in which she talks about the formation of the AME Church. Man, I should be able to have these at command, and I'm blanking on them. But Carol George.
And you mentioned Richard Allen's memoir. I think that's like.
Yeah, so that's a primary source. You could Google that. You should be able to find that online.
I think it's like 99 cents on Kindle.
Yeah. That that's pretty. Even the AME House has that. Just on general principle, right? It's easy to obtain that, but it's interesting to read through that as well. It's a great primary source. Richard Nelson wrote the most recent biography on Richard Allen and the church. It's very, very good. I also recommend that. That's also very, very helpful. Yeah, there are a few others that can come to mind, and I can send them to you. You can kind of post them a little bit later if you wanted to do that. But those two are sort of go-to ones. There are more recent ones, but those two are, they still have legs, even though they're a little bit older. They still have legs in terms of, an entry point, in terms of trying to find out the basics. It still works.
Well, how can people get in contact with you on social media?
Yes, I'm on Twitter at Nick01902. That's my Twitter handle, and I'm also on Facebook. I believe, yeah, you can look me up on Facebook as well. Those are my two places.
Awesome, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Rowe. This has been a great conversation, and I know our listeners will enjoy it.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.